Hello, and greetings to our distinguished speakers and guests. My name is Johanna Pittman. I am the CEO of Advance Global Australians, and I am delighted to welcome you to the Advance Global Town Hall focusing on sustainability. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from today, the Darug people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In light of today's topic, it is fundamental to recognise and learn from the incredible connection that Indigenous people of Australia have had with land and country for many thousands of years, and the land we wish to protect and preserve with timely discussions like the one we are about to have today. I extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that may be joining us today. And welcome to our audience from Cairns to Perth, from Arizona to Armenia. We are pleased but not surprised to see such far-reaching interest in today's topic. Welcome to the speakers you will meet shortly, and thank you to the presenters who contributed their perspectives via video interviews. Bringing together these Australian thought leaders and experts from across the sustainability domain on the most pressing and immediate challenge of this decade is an immense privilege. And I'm personally very excited to learn more about the increasing role Australia will play in sustainability going forward. For those of you new to Advance, we are the professional network of global Australians. This network includes around 1 million global Australians currently working overseas and about 2.5 million international alumni who gained an Australian education. For 20 years, Advance has worked to build a global network of Australia's diaspora and to keep this network connected professionally with Australia. Our endeavours have enjoyed consistent bipartisan government support, as well as sponsorship by Australian corporates and generous donors. At the heart of what we do is a belief in the positive, soft power Australians can exert overseas and the immense benefits that Australia can gain from our global talent. This Sustainability Town Hall is an opportunity to bring together some of the greatest minds on this topic and share their insights with decision makers in Australia. And we also have the town hall as an opportunity to update the advanced community, many who have been away from Australia for decades, on the developments in Australia. And today we explore what is happening in Australia around environmental sustainability, what actions are needed now, and how Australia can become a world leader in the field. To those who have submitted questions before this event, and thank you to all who have completed our first Slido poll. You'll see that if you haven't had a chance, you could see to complete it yet, you can do so on the right hand of the screen or on mobile devices. You'll see the polls option in the menu along the top of the screen. We would love you to engage with this discussion as it proceeds. And so if you join us in the polls, and you can also please add your questions via the Q&A tab. How's today's going to run? We'll kick off with live and video presentations from our lineup of experts who have experience working overseas and at home in Australia. We've tried to create a jigsaw, bringing together the many disparate and interrelated fields of sustainability with two guiding questions. Where can leadership come from right now? And how do we build Australian expertise to ensure we take the lead? What actions are needed? We will then have a panel discussion based on your pre-submitted questions and all the live questions from the Q&A section of the screen. So to kick things off, our first speaker this morning is Dr. Saul Griffith, an inventor, author, entrepreneur and scientist focused on a global effort to electrify everything. When the audience registered for this event, we asked about your areas of interest, everyone's areas of interest, and overwhelmingly, renewable energy had the most responses. So it is fitting to turn to Saul to kick things off and to kick off the presentations to share his perspective on how we can transform the energy landscape to one powered by renewable electricity. Thanks, Saul.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Advance, for the privilege of being here to talk. I'm a Saul Griffith, recently repatriated Australian, now living in Wollongong. I spent the last 25 years in the US getting my PhD and then starting a slew of mostly clean energy technology companies in Silicon Valley, in offshore wind, in industrial solar power, in heating and air conditioning, in energy storage. Over that long career, I studied a lot about energy specifically and around how you reform our energy economy to solve climate change. That culminated in this book, which is called Electrify. It prosecutes the argument that 3/4 or more of our emissions will be solved through end-use electrification and providing that with renewables. In some respects, that book was a love note to the incoming president of the US, now Joe Biden, imploring America to do its part in leading the world on climate. In the dirty reality of contemporary American politics, not enough is happening in the US on climate, to be very honest. That led me to write this book. This is not an advertisement for my books, but at least it's sort of a footnote if you want to follow up. And the big switch really prosecutes the argument that Australia is the first country in the world where the economics of electrifying all of the things in your life and providing that with renewable energy is in the economic interest of every Australian household and every Australian community. That itself is an Australian success story because it's born on the back of the innovations that happened at the University of New South Wales in photovoltaics. It led to what's known internationally as the Australian rooftop solar miracle, the fact that the cheapest energy in the world delivered to an end consumer on Earth right now is Australian rooftop solar. So Australia has done one piece of the puzzle correctly. We have terrible electric vehicle policy. We have essentially no building electrification policy. So we're lacking on the other two, but we have the opportunity to get there very quickly. As a cautionary note, in Australia, the failure of Australian climate politics for 30 years is talking about things that we might do in the future. We're still talking about hydrogen hubs and agricultural carbon sequestration. These are worthy things, but they will not really come online at scale to fix climate and heal our ecosystems for a decade. And we know that we've got to get 50+% emissions reductions this decade. That brings me to the things that we know how to do today, that we can do today, that we must do today, which is electrifying our lifestyles. What does that mean for the average Australian? It means electrifying the 1.8 vehicles in our driveways. It means electrifying the kitchen. It means electrifying your water heater. It means electrifying your space heater. It means putting solar on your roof and a battery on the side of your house. That itself is a big narrative change from how historically we've thought about energy infrastructure. Australians love infrastructure. We give special privileged finance to infrastructure. We fight elections over infrastructure, but we still talk about infrastructure like it's the 20th century and it's roads, bridges, dams, snowy, hydro 2.0. The 20 million vehicles in Australian driveways will have a battery 6 times the size of snowy 2.0. It is time for us to call our suburbs infrastructure because it will be the demand side machines that we need to replace in Australia urgently. And what I mean by urgently is essentially to hit any target under 2 degrees now, your next car and every next car in Australia must be electric. No one can ever buy a natural gas powered appliance again. So it is over the next 20 years, we're going to buy 100 million machines in Australia, these demand side machines. We need to make 100 million correct electric choices and we need to power it with rooftop solar. If we declare that infrastructure, we give access to finance and credit to every single household to participate in this, the prize could be enormous. And because Australia is still the luckiest country with the best renewables, a very handy, convenient regulatory environment that works in the interests typically of everyday Australians, if we do this right, every single Australian household will save $4,000 to $5,000 a year on their cost of energy and vehicles and transportation for the household. We lead America by about 5 years on that because of our natural advantages in renewables and because of our low population density. And we lead Europe by perhaps 10 years. Australia, after 30 years of being honestly a climate pariah whose peer nations on the global climate stage have been Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, namely petrostates, has strangely the opportunity to leap to become first in the world, to get the gold medal in decarbonization, but it's only going to happen through changing our policy and our mindset, declaring our small businesses and our households infrastructure, electrifying everything on the demand side, empowering it with our profligate Australian renewables. That could be the abundance agenda for Australia. It should be bipartisan. It's a win for everyone of every colour in Australia. Let's get on with it.
Thank you, Saul. What a powerful call to action. And I don't think there's any Australian that doesn't want to go from pariah to gold medal winner. Just it appeals to all of us. Now, for those that are watching along with the poll on the side, we know that our audience truly is global, and we've got, and this is the live audience. Obviously, we'll be sharing the recording for those that are joining in different time zones, but really a global audience, a lot of people joining from the US, South Korea, Singapore, and all over Australia. This is a real testament to the importance of this debate and the relevance of it to so many people. We will now hear from Caroline Angoorly, who is usually based in New York, but we were lucky that this town hall coincided with a long-awaited visit back to Australia for Caroline. She has unique experience in building and running clean energy and sustainable infrastructure funds, and we'll get to hear about one of those, including a self-sustaining green bank. Thanks, Caroline.
Joanna, thank you very much. Thank you to Advance for this event today and for including me, and to all the participants. Let's move to the first slide. Just to ground our conversation here today, I wanted to start with a fundamental question. And that is, we all hear about sustainability, we all hear about ESG, it's everywhere we look, it's everything we hear, but is it just hype and froth? So I thought, to earth the sort of my part of the conversation today, I'd present this graphic, which is from the US SIF Foundation, which is a non-profit that advocates for sustainable and responsible investment. They do a biennial trends report. And so the last report was issued in 2021. And what this graphic shows you, without even having to see the fine print, is obviously a massive increase in sustainable investing strategies since really 2012. And then since the last report, an increase of assets under management in sustainable investments up by 42%. So between 2018 and 2020, there's been a rising to over $17 trillion in sustainable investing in the US. So short answer, not just hype and froth. Next slide, please. What we're seeing is that this has been influencing significant investment decisions and activities, as seen on the previous slide. And what this is showing on the left-hand side is an excerpt from a letter by Larry Fink to CEOs. And he's the CEO himself of BlackRock, which is the largest investment fund in the United States. Larry Fink, for the last number of years, has written a letter to CEOs, really in his fiduciary capacity as an investor in many, many companies. And for the last number of years, he has been saying that sustainability is creating a tectonic shift in investment. This year's letter, which is excerpted on the left-hand side of your screen, is no different. And you can see that his quote there is, "Every company and every industry will be transformed by the transition to a net zero world." On the right-hand side, a little clip from Institutional Investor, and basically saying that if we were frightened that something like COVID or other economic disturbances were going to make people think twice about sustainability investment and think of it more as a discretionary spend that was the first thing to go out the window when economic times got tough, think again. There's evidence that throughout the pandemic, for example, that sustainability investing and ESG funds have outperformed. Next slide, please. But what do we mean when we talk about sustainability and sustainable finance? And what I've tried to do on this slide, it's a little bit wordy, but I've tried to set out the what, why, and who. And think about it really that sustainable finance is allocating capital. So that means it's not just banks. It's not just businesses that are in the business of lending capital to other businesses or private equity investing capital in other businesses. It's every single entity that is making a decision about allocating capital. It's our governments, it's our non-profits, it's foundations, it's sovereign wealth funds, it's all the folks listed at the bottom of the slide. And what does this mean? We're allocating capital to essentially sustainable investments that are about decarbonising and circular economy. And why are people doing this? They're doing this obviously because there's a growing recognition of the far-reaching and devastating effects of climate change. Many of them are doing this because there are, regulatory requirements on them to meet standards, but there are increasing numbers of very powerful companies, governments, and people who are doing this by making voluntary commitments in line with the Paris Accord and the IPCC reports and what have you. Next slide, please. So what are the key drivers here? Why is this happening? And what I try to identify on this slide is what I call the confluence of central factors. We've got this growing awareness and acceptance of the science and the reality, the enormity of the problem, and that is really now across the board. It's in politics, it's in corporates, and it's at the individual level. Companies are making these voluntary commitments that I mentioned earlier, and we see them very prominently. And it's folks like Google and HP and Nike and other names that you know very well. And what they're doing that's very important is not just putting their own organization on the line to make a commitment. They're basically saying, if you do business with me as part of my supply chain, you also have to make these commitments. We've got international accords, we've got government action, and importantly, and as Saul had mentioned, this is a way that people can actually make returns. This isn't about charity. This is about good business. Next slide, please. We are, though, still, I think, near the beginning, and we need to stay committed and move faster. And to this end, what do I think the most critical success factors are? It's about consumer, shareholder, investor, broad stakeholder-led activity. Never underestimate the power that we have in voting our dollars and in activism. We really need government to play an important role here. The regulatory framework is critical. We need certainty, we need consistency, and sometimes this is going to involve market redesigns and changes in required laws. We need to stay focused and not be paralyzed by the size of the problem. We need to do something and just keep chipping away on it. And we need a price on carbon. Next slide, please. One quick example here, electricity is really my game, energy projects. This is showing how sustainability is transforming electricity markets from the previous centralized power, hub and spoke, to what clean local power is bi-directional distributed power generation. Next slide, please. New York State is, I think, one shining example in a country that I think has had a lack of federal leadership on sustainability, and I think we have seen a real surge of state activity, which has created momentum and a head of steam that has led the country. What I've listed on this slide, and you'll have access to these later, are some details of what New York State has done. Created a clean energy fund of $5.3 billion, which included New York Green Bank, which is $1 billion state-funded investment fund. And I was actually the founding COO and CFO of that fund. New York's created a clean energy standard where there's got to be 70% generation from renewable resources by 2030, 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. There are also a number of mandates, as you'll see on the right-hand side, about how much offshore wind, by what date, how much distributed solar, how much energy storage, and the phasing out of internal combustion engines. Next slide, please. So New York Green Bank, of which I'm very proud. I was there for almost 6 years, as I said, as the founding COO, CFO. We took a concept from a blank sheet of paper to what is now a fully fledged, basically the analog of a private credit infra fund. And you'll see that over the period that New York Green Bank has been in existence, which is essentially since 2014, they've invested over $1.7 US. That leverages a total project value of up to $4.2 billion. It's over 100 transactions across 8 technology, clean, sustainable segments. And then on the bottom half of the slide, you see what the environmental benefit has been. Importantly, in terms of avoided CO2 and cars taken off the road, but also energy efficiency and reduction in gas usage. So I'll leave it there and look forward to come back and touching on some of these themes in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Caroline. So helpful to understand and lay out those confluence of factors at the beginning of our discussion, and for really sharing what is possible through sustainable finance. I will note, thank you everyone who has answered the first poll. We'll be posting 3 more questions throughout the event, so don't miss those. Our next speaker wears many hats. Professor Quentin Grafton is a professor of economics at ANU and holds the UNESCO chair in water economics and transboundary water governance, among many other roles. Quentin's research and leadership spans across environmental issues and public policy responses, and is a global expert on water economics. Over to you, Quentin.
Thanks so much, Joanna. It's a real pleasure. And Yuma, hello. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal Ngambri country, which is the Australian Capital Territory, and I pay my respects to elders, past and present. So, as the introduction highlighted, I do have I do also have a group around me, and we have 60 plus members in the Water Justice Hub. The Water Justice Hub has been established for a couple of years now, and it's really about looking at the issues of equity, justice in terms of basic water needs, but also in terms of distributional justice, as well as who gets a seat at the table, who gets to talk. So my presentation, 5 minutes or less, is really about the response that we need to have to those global water crises that we're currently facing. Of course, as Australians, whether we live in Australia, we live overseas, we're well aware that we live, if we live in Australia, a semi or arid continent in most of the locations. Obviously, we get a lot of water in the north of Australia, but we have to respond to the crises that are coming, not only in Australia, but globally. So what are these crises? Well, there's a number of them coming. And one way to think about it is to think about what's so-called green water. That's the evaporation, transpiration, and soil moisture that we have globally. Now, we've reached, according to recent authors, came out a couple of weeks ago, looking at planetary boundaries. Those planetary boundaries are really, really important. If we start to cross them, and we already have crossed them in a number of dimensions, as you can see in the top left of this corner of the figure, once we start to cross them, we are into those high-risk situations, and the resilience of our systems, our operating systems, become diminished. And so we need to do something about it. So we have to respond to a crisis by doing something and by acting. And so what are the requirements? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that there's a problem. We need to recognize there's a planetary boundary when it comes to water, and we need to start to do something about it. And what do I mean, start to do something about it? Well, the justice aspect is key to this, but it also is about the amount of water that we're extracting, and more importantly, that we're consuming, the evaporating and evapotranspiration. That includes in agriculture, includes households, includes urban areas as well. But the biggest consumer of water in Australia and globally is agriculture. So if we're going to really make this work, we're going to have to work in the agricultural space. And so one of the things that needs to be connected, and it hasn't been until recently, Glasgow was an exception, Glasgow COP26 last year, is the connection between water and climate change. And you can see here, hopefully you can see that water in the context of disasters and emergencies, 24% here are related to riverine floods, but there are other flooding events and coastal floods that represent a good proportion of the climate change emergencies. In addition, we add on to that the droughts in the food-producing areas of the world, including parts of Australia. And we have a major problem here as climate is changing. And it's not only going to change, it already has changed. So water has to be part of that solution and that response. And so what are the things that need to be done? Well, there's a long list, but let's just go through step by step. First of all, we need to have sustainable surface and also groundwater extractions so we can restore and maintain ecosystem services, whether it's be biodiversity or just simply having enough water for communities. And keep in mind that there are communities in Western New South Wales who literally ran out of water at the last drought in 2019. We also need to have safe drinking water. You may not know that about 250,000 Australians in one of the richest countries in the world don't have access to drinking water that meets the Australians' drinking water safety guidelines. We also need to have better planning. We have a Murray-Darling Basin plan, but we need better planning in terms of what we do and actually implement plans. Australia's been very good at implementing, talking about and legislating, but we've been much less successful at implementation. We also need the basics, the metrics, whether it's investing or whether it's water. We need a water accounting. We need to know what's happening. We need to know who's got the water, what they're doing with that water, and how they're applying it. And of course, and last but certainly not least, we have the Uluru Statement from the Heart from 4 years ago. There's a whole set of issues around recognition of Indigenous rights in Australia, and that also applies to water and water rights. So Indigenous Australians own or control about 40% of the landmass of Australia, but they have less than 1% of the water rights. We've got to do something about that. So let's take this forward. Well, what do we do? Well, there's a so-called theory of change, and you're probably familiar with it, but there's a sphere of control that we can actually directly influence ourselves. But also it goes to an influence beyond our control and, of course, into an interest. And we're all in that space. Every one of us is in that mix of that different spaces. And in terms of what I do and what the Water Justice Hub does, we focus on a lot of outputs, but we only focus on the outputs to lead to the outcomes. We think of the outcomes first and then go back to the outputs. Whatever you are, whatever you do, you need to be thinking in this space. And then, of course, we need to be forward thinking. We need to think about what's called the future cone. So we are in 2022. Let's think out to 2050, less than 30 years away, and think of where we're going in business as usual. Whether it's electrification, whether it's sustainable investing, whether it's responding to water crisis, business as usual is not a good future for us as a globe and not a good future for us as Australians. So we got to shift it. We got to shift what that future is to something that we want to happen. Okay, and we can make that happen. And that's about planning, thinking about possibilities and opportunities. It's not a projection or forecast. It's simply doing something now, acting together, leveraging the influence and controls that we have to deliver a better future for ourselves and, of course, Australians to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. Water is such a critical part of the climate change challenge, as you showed, and thank you for highlighting the justice and equity issues to be considered in driving towards the outcomes we want. We are now moving to our final live speaker, Professor Veena Sahajwalla. Sorry, I did practice that. Sahajwalla. There we go. Professor Veena Sahajwalla. Veena is doing incredible work in transforming waste. Well known for her work, Veena's groundbreaking research and numerous innovations place her at the cutting edge of technology. Over to you, Veena.
Thanks very much, Johanna, for that very kind introduction, for the invitation to be here today. Something that I'm really passionate about. Sustainability is, touches all of us in ways that we probably don't realize. And I wanted to pick up on one specific example, which is really around waste. And I know when we think about waste recycling, we sort of assume that it's either you can recycle materials or you can't. And often sort of, we're told that, oh, look, these are impossible to recycle. And I guess part of what I want to leave behind today is really thinking about how these material resources are actually valuable resources as part of our economy, as part of our supply chains, our ability to actually make all the things that we need, whether it is, for our homes, whether it is for indeed achieving electrification and creating devices that we just become so used to. And we know, of course, that when we think about advances in technology, we can't just detach it to the point that, well, it's a machine, somebody's going to give you a machine and off we go. What we are realizing very quickly, of course, is in the current sort of conditions that supply chains of materials, resources, products are very much front and center of minds, which means if we are going to value all those goods and services and products that we need for our education, for our health, our well-being, to just do everything that we want to in our lives, and to be able to do it in a way that we don't leave anybody behind. We think about sustainable housing as an example. And how do we make sure that no matter where you are in the world, we will be able to make those basic building materials? And we, of course, do understand that that takes resources, that takes materials, it takes energy to make. So what does that have to do with waste? And I guess the connectivity is in that simple connection between all kinds of things that we throw away in terms of our waste glass, our textiles, our waste batteries. All of these important materials actually can be reformed and put that towards production. And when we actually start to do that in a way that is decentralized, that is affordable, it enables and empowers our communities across Australia and indeed across the world to take advantage of what we are now calling as waste, but fully recognizing that these are useful resources. So let me pick up on examples of things that we have actually made in our microfactories. And I'll hold up these kinds of examples of our green ceramic tiles. And you might just sort of then start to wonder, well, what do these tiles have to do with the kinds of waste resources that I've been talking about? You might actually be interested to know that in our microfactories, that are regional microfactories, we use waste glass and waste textiles in this particular example. And there's a whole long list of other materials that we use in our microfactories. But to be able to create these kinds of products from waste textiles and waste glass in a way that they're decentralized, so that you can imagine microfactories being set up in regional and remote Australia, allowing communities to really be empowered, where we learn from each other. And I guess part of the reason why we're excited about a lot of that fundamental research, which of course we acknowledge the fact that research provides that platform. But the other important next step is about sustainability in terms of delivering those practical, tangible solutions in a way we can actually show that it makes environmental sense, but it also makes business sense to do so. And I guess this is where, of course, from our context, one of the things that we are really proud to host is on Sustainable Communities and Waste Hub. This is funded through the National Environmental Science Program. It really gives communities, businesses, big and small, to really come together and collaborate. And I think when we're talking about a collaborative future, if I go right back to that point I was making earlier about supply chains, we have access to all of these materials literally in our backyard. We know there's no shortage of materials like waste textiles. How do we actually incorporate that in making these important building materials and products? We know we have access to waste batteries. They come out of our homes. We know we have access to all of these goods that if we were to reclassify them as useful resources, what we do need is the capacity and ability to bring about manufacturing solutions in a decentralized way, so we can add value and we can, of course, create those local jobs, transform those resources into valuable materials and products and deploy them in our economy. So this is exactly what we have proven can be done. Our very first regional microfactory that was launched in Cootamundra in New South Wales last year is an exemplar of that. And we are on our journey to deploying more and more microfactories, which allows our communities to collaborate and deploy technology. And Australia leads the world in these microfactory solutions so that we can actually provide hopefully real world, practical, tangible solutions to show sustainability in action that delivers, of course, a win-win outcome for our people and for our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veena. Your expertise and experience and proving that transformation of waste can happen and how it happens is an inspiration, and particularly to its students who are focusing on STEM and sustainability. You'll see what I mean in a comment from one of our contributors later in the program. Now let's take a moment to share the results of our poll. We asked, how much do you know about sustainability? And it's great to see such a range of knowledge. We know that many people are here today to learn, and that's fantastic. And we'll launch the next poll momentarily. And feel free to start adding your questions in preparation for the panel discussion. Our journey across the different aspects of environmental sustainability continues. We've explored renewable energy, financing mechanisms, water, and research-led innovations around waste. We now explore something very close to home, in fact, right in our homes. Our next speaker, Ronni Kahn, is CEO and founder of Ozharvest. For those in Australia, you might have seen Ozharvest billboards imploring action to combat food waste, and they've been really prolific at the moment. Ronnie is currently travelling, but recorded this presentation for us. Thank you.
Surprisingly enough, most of us don't realise that food waste feeds climate change. What that means is every time we throw food, surplus organic produce into landfill, it gives off methane gases. And unbelievably, the gases that come out of food waste are worse than plastic production and worse than coal production. I know it's hard to believe. So every time, what you can do is not waste food. I just want each and every one of us to know that our individual actions do count, and every single one of us can make a difference. So if you want to become a climate activist, you don't have to be able to go and buy an electric vehicle. You don't have to be able to put solar on your roof. But the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit is if each and every one of us did not waste our food. If we used it up, and we have a little tool how not to waste food, to use it up, we would be making the biggest difference that will affect climate change. We can all do this. The question of where sustainability leadership is coming from in this country today is a challenge, because all the time that our elected leaders are not absolutely committed to making us a global leader in sustainability, it is a challenge. But that's where each and every one of us come in. That is where our unicorns come in. And just know that every action we take does make a difference. So you can find the ways that you in your life become a leader, because we are all leaders. And how we lead our life sustainably, with how we purchase, with how we manage our household waste, every aspect of that does make a difference.
Our sincere thanks to Ronnie for sharing her perspective. Now, an incredible part of the work of Ozharvest is to rescue food from going to landfill and transform it into a meal for those experiencing food insecurity in Australia. And this conversation, we're hearing about where Australia can lead. And we learnt last year that Ozharvest is sharing their expertise with other organisations around the world, including with a social enterprise led by an Australian in Vietnam. If you search Ozharvest, you'll see the way in which Ozharvest their experience in Australia is benefiting others around the world and showing that global leadership. Now, many of you answered the latest poll. Let's show those results. We asked, who is taking leadership on sustainability in Australia? And we see that the audience really sees that leadership coming from nonprofits and advocacy organisations, and close behind that from consumers. We've got not a lot of mention for the federal government there. We've got a lot of mention for state governments. So we can see that we've got a distributed leadership model that is emerging at this time, and we're seeing that leadership from many aspects of society, but it's not being led by government. In fact, we asked this same question when interviewing 4 more experts in different areas of sustainability. Let's watch that video and hear what they had to say.
We are a big part of the problem, and it's a scary thing to admit, but we really are. When it comes to, if we look at emissions as a starting point, we are one of the leading industries in the world when it comes to emitting carbon, and that is not something you want to lead in, and it's and that's just the starting point. When it comes to textile and fashion waste, especially as Australia, as a country, we are, I think, second to the UK when it comes to textile waste, which is terrible as well, and that's obviously stemming from fashion, and that's not even including the other waste throughout the supply chain and all the other environmental and social impacts as well. Before we committed to doing our full study on our footprint, we wanted to get an understanding of what the process would be like, and so we did a scoping study. And in that scoping study, we chose to do it on one of our legendary Kingston suits, which we absolutely adore, and especially working so closely with Kingston Farm, being able to produce a single origin product. Kingston Farm is already a certified carbon positive farm, which is great, but we were curious around the emissions associated, particularly with the sheep. And so in our scoping study, what we discovered for our Kingston suit is 52% of the carbon footprint of the whole creation of the garment came from farm level because of the sheep. And it was their methane emissions. And so that was the kind of the origins of what is now our zero emission wool project. How we are able to try achieve zero emission wool is through feeding the sheep a very specific type of seaweed called Asparagopsis. And Asparagopsis is grown with our partners over at Sea Forest in Tasmania. I believe it is a native seaweed, and it interacts with the enzymes in the sheep's gut, and it means that it's able to achieve some incredible methane abatement results. And so they're still trying to solidify what that number looks like and where we are as well. But put it really simply, is it definitely reduces the carbon footprint and the methane emissions coming from sheep and livestock in general. In reality, if I could simplify the answer, it's all together, everyone taking the steps that they can take. We need government to start acting on it. We need individual businesses to start deciding that we can't just wait for government and legislation. We need to take those first steps. We need B Corps. It's a journey that we want to embark on. We need that process to be guided, to be supported, so that more companies can go on that journey to be better. Same with all certifications. The journey to sustainability is definitely not a downhill, it's definitely an uphill. But, if you can do it all together, then I think it makes the journey not necessarily easier, but more possible.
There's a huge amount of furniture ends up in landfill. There are certain furniture companies out there that created a perspective that furniture was a disposable commodity, and I think that was really irresponsible of them. But I think it's going to take a while for people to change their perception. And so we sort of talk about this idea of being considered in making these big decisions. when we're looking at it from a design perspective, our sort of philosophy is that we want to create future heirlooms. We also couple that design philosophy with a real commitment to servicing our products. So we are designing everything now so that it has things like removable covers, but they still look like a fitted sort of standard sofa, not a dust cover. For our whole education furniture range, everything can be broken down into its components on site. It never has to leave the education facility for it to be repaired, which is fantastic. So it's a real sort of change in philosophy. But I think we are kind of quite far ahead of the game when it comes to things like that. I think we have a huge responsibility. Even if you're looking at SMEs in Australia, when actually 99% of all businesses in Australia are SMEs, we're 50% of our GDP and we employ over 7 million people. So I sort of think every one of us has a responsibility to play our role in tackling climate change and in taking climate action. And I really feel strongly that, particularly for us, we're the originators of products, we're the ones that come up with the ideas. If we don't take responsibility for those products over their life cycle, then really who will? I see very little in government. So that's sort of an area, I think, where there is a real dearth in leadership. I think most of the real leadership is coming from actually probably more privately owned businesses than shareholder owned. I think there's, at some point in the future, if we're really going to be able to tackle climate change, I think this market expectation of kind of continuing shareholder returns needs to change. I think there needs to be a transition to circular economic frameworks for all product development. That's a huge transition for a lot of companies, but I can't see any other way that we can operate really, unless this starts to become part of all companies' thinking and we really start to embrace this as a concept and recognise that, we can't have this disposability anymore. At least a 60% reduction in emissions by 2030 is really what we need. Like, anything less than that and we're just playing at the fringes and won't enable us to transition in an orderly way fast enough to allow us also to take advantage of the incredible opportunities that are out there if we transition to a low emissions economy. The rest of the world's doing it and we're going to get left behind if we don't step on that bandwagon and also actively grab it with two hands and see it as being an opportunity for Australia to play a real leadership role.
Oh, look, there are a lot of things. The biggest one for me is for the major parties to look coal communities in the eye and say, coal is finished. Within 10 years, we will not be digging any more coal up. We are now going to work with you to come up with the alternatives. This zero-sum game of, we've got to have coal because there are no other jobs. That is a complete lack of imagination for all of the smarts, all of the bureaucracy and policymakers, all of the innovation coming out of universities, all of the money sloshing around in Australia's superannuation, and all of the innovators and the entrepreneurs to think that we can't do anything other than dig coal up and sell it overseas is just, it doesn't do a service at all. So I would want to see, and there should be alternative plans, a blue team and a red team both saying, no, our plan's better, rather than, no, we're going to continue with the 116 coal, gas and oil projects because we wouldn't dare upset anybody. The globe isn't going to want to buy our stuff. Each time I see someone interviewed from the Hunter or Gladstone or La Trobe, they say, we know coal's days are numbered, but we still want to live here and we still want to feed our families and pay our mortgages and live where we live. So to say we're just going to cut it off, that's not realistic. But to say we're going to continue is also a lie, because it can't continue. It's about action. This critical decade, yes, being informed is really important. It's a foundation, but it's not the only thing, and you don't need perfect information to get going. For a business, for any organisation or any individual, it's about doing and acting and influencing, not about worrying and not about guilt. We don't have the time frame for sequential top-down leadership to be the only option. We need community leaders from bottom up. We need business leaders in every business, and not just the leader in the business. Anybody in the business can ask the questions, can introduce concepts, can start to say, have we thought of this? Here's an opportunity that I heard about, what can we do? It has to be all of us holding hands and collaboratively stepping forward together, because this is the critical decade. We know this is the time, the next 8 years, to dramatically cut our carbon emissions. There are many other environmental issues, but from a climate point of view, the big strides have to happen now and simultaneously, not sequentially.
Definitely still waste management. We're one of the worst countries in the world for waste management. For example, Germany, they've had the most amazing waste management system for so many years. They don't have bins in their houses. They're all down the street. And because in Australia we have so much room, so we just make new landfills because that's currently the cheapest option. But we also have so many people in Australia who are creating all these amazing inventions that we can use to transform this waste into a resource. There's a lot of focus around youth and our role in leadership and sustainability, because we are doing a lot and it is our future that we're trying to get people to invest in. But there are also lots of small businesses, for example, again, going back to waste management, Doyle Brothers. So they're a family business and they process about 2% of Sydney's waste, but their facilities are so different to every other place in Australia because they only deal with commercial waste and all the garbage is just commingled waste, but they're able to separate it out into different components and get it recycled or sent to the gasification plant in Japan. Saying that, we do still have good leaders, like Matt Keane, for example. He's trying to make change happen, but it's very slow because he doesn't have much support. Professor Veena, who's going to be speaking, I find her really inspiring and I've read a lot of things about her. And also Kate Marvel, who's a climate scientist, and she cuts through misinformation about climate change in ways that are easy for general public to understand. It might not be your future that you're looking after, but your children's or your grandchildren or any family members or anyone that you know, it's their future. So it'd be great to see politicians actually do something about climate change, actually write policies that aren't just, oh yeah, we can see it in the future, there'll be technology in the future. We have the technology now to do things. We have the resources in Australia. We have the ability to be leading the world in climate action, and yet we're not doing it.
Thank you, Athena, Sasha, Hudson and Sophie for sharing your perspectives. You've allowed this discussion to include the role of consumers, businesses, and the next generation. We've covered a lot of ground, and to discuss it, let's welcome back our panelists for the Q&A. You'll notice we've got a new member on the panel. We've invited Fiona Bednarz, the Executive Manager for Environment and Climate at Suncorp, to join the panel. Thank you, Fiona. As the questions rolled in before the event, we could see that the role of banks and insurance providers is top of mind for many, and that there are many questions about how large publicly listed corporations are addressing environmental sustainability. So we'll turn to Fiona in just a moment. But Caroline, I noticed you nodding throughout those videos. As someone who has been away from Australia for many years, what did you take away from it?
Thank you. I think two main things. The first is the similarity of the issues and the successful approaches the world over, whether it's Europe, the United States, or Australia. And it's what I would call the all of the above approach. And that is, it's not, oh, there's one answer here and that person over there needs to do something about it. It's that there are a myriad of approaches and we all need to be doing something about it now. And then I think the second thing I really took away from it was hope that there are people in all sorts of industries, all sizes of companies, all ages in Australia who are really doing the yeoman's work. And that gives me hope for the future.
Fiona, we know that climate change and the resulting weather-related disasters are among the biggest risks for the insurance industry. Can you tell us about Suncorp's journey and your experience working within an organisation with clear sustainability targets? And if I can add in one of our audience questions, why haven't large companies acted sooner?
Big questions. I'll start with Suncorp's journey. So Suncorp started quite early on, I guess, in a leadership position around the Paris Agreement, declaring our support for the Paris Agreement. And so I guess you could say that we started our net zero journey quite early in introducing fossil fuel standards that begin to look at how we will begin to align our lending, our underwriting, our investment portfolios to a 1.5 degree scenario. And also looking particularly at our investment portfolios and adding a shadow carbon price there. So there's sort of, I guess, two mechanisms that we looked at early on around what is it that we can begin to do now as we wrap our heads around the concept of a 1.5 degree scenario. And so that was under the previous climate action plan. We've recently launched our second climate change action plan, which really begins to build out and give clarity around how we're tackling the next sort of 3 to 5 years, noting that there absolutely is no playbook. And at the foundation of this plan is acknowledging that, from a financial institution perspective, we know that the materiality and the intensity of our emissions exist within financed emissions, so within that lending, underwriting, and investment portfolio. So the plan acknowledges that we really need to work hard to support our customers, engage our fund managers, our suppliers in better understanding and working with them on what their credible net zero transition pathway is. It sounds easy, but again, it's just the only way that we can be successful in that is through collaboration. So a cornerstone of this plan is partnering with purpose and really working together and understanding what is the ecosystem of change that needs to happen to ensure that we can begin to align our portfolios. So that in a nutshell is the real focus for Suncorp Group. And I guess in terms of the role of private sector and the varying levels of commitment that's happening, I think particularly within the financial services space, what is very encouraging is the way that capital markets are aligning themselves to a net zero transition. So through the UN, there's a lot of net zero alliances that are signaling that sustainable capital flows are in a net zero transition. And, it's through that collective alliance that together industries globally and domestically can to really piece together, this is actually how we begin to find the answers to this very tricky problem to solve.
Thanks, Fiona. And you make it sound like it's been an easy journey to pull together this the climate change action plan. What was that experience like? You've got the scaffolding there with your different alliances, but what was that journey like internally to put that together?
The internal engagement is key, and I think this is the the biggest challenge I think that corporates face is one, wrapping their heads around sustainability and how do we really match that to the materiality within the business and really take an impact approach around existing portfolios and customers. And it's not about sustainability sitting off to the side as an adjunct. It's about figuring out how we embed sustainability into our business. Working really closely. We've got, working really closely with, say, for instance, the commercial insurance team, where we know from an emissions perspective, there is, a lot to be done around the net zero transition within there. So it's about figuring out what are the systems, processes, capabilities that's required, and how do we not bring necessarily net zero experts into the business, but it's about saying how do we build a net zero edge to our business so it becomes foundational to the way that we do things, the way that our strategy's rolled out, and the way that we engage with our customers.
So we've got a question here from Daryl around your statements around solar and storage. He said it's 100% agree, but thinks that the regulation and licensing sign-off of installation is 95% of the sticking point. Everyone knows of a domestic battery or regulator fire, which gets a lot of media attention and spin. And so it's quite a technical question, but it goes to that question around sort of exaggerating the challenge and not looking at the upside. How do we prevent dangerous installs? How do we keep moving towards those goals that you so clearly articulated? Saul, just I think you've muted.
Sorry, everyone. Here I am again. This question is maybe the most important question that's underappreciated in climate change. As energy consumers, and energy is the majority of our emissions, the majority of the cost of those emissions to a retail consumer is actually regulatory in some way or another. This can make sense to you because we've had 150 years of quite improved standards of living due to fossil fuels, but that was by writing our rules and regulations, rules for the grid, building codes, vehicle standards, etc., for a fossil fuel world, including subsidies, including all of the above. In fact, it's a regulatory innovation in Australia that's responsible for our rooftop solar miracle. Solar in Australia installs at 90 cents a watt, which is 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a quarter of the cost of the grid here. In the US, because they have undue regulatory burden on rooftop solar, it's $3 a watt and it's more expensive than grid provided electricity. This explains 2% penetration in the US and 30+% in Australia. Same's true for batteries, which are now, I can buy cells for $120 a kilowatt hour, but when you install a Tesla Powerwall or an LG battery, largely due to regulatory burden, it's installing on your wall at about $1,400 a kilowatt hour. We need regulation optimization through the complete energy stack from product to the consumer. We need to completely rewrite the rules of the Australian electricity market, which were written bluntly for coal. Unless this is actually an opportunity for bipartisanship. I've had Ted Cruz personally screaming at me about we need deregulation to unleash the energy miracle, and this is where I could actually agree with Ted Cruz. We need to rewrite the regulations for this abundant electrical future we could have, and in order to make sure that we're not artificially increasing the cost of electric vehicles, of batteries, of solar, etc. And this is a problem everywhere in the world, something that needs to be at the top priority of any politician in this game.
Thanks, Saul. We've got a question here from Jess in Brisbane. What I don't understand is if the business case is so strong and renewables are now cheaper than coal, what is holding up progress? And I might turn to Veena for this because I know that you've been navigating over the years this convincing convincing leaders and that progress is possible. Why is it taking so long?
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. I mean, I guess, if you had to sort of put it into context, in the world of using energy to do manufacturing, so this is sort of coming into more that sort of industrial domain. We've talked about how consumers use power, but now if you come into how you actually bring renewables, how you bring, our examples of things like green steel, if I can use that as an example for a moment. I mean, for us, we have shown very clearly that there are multiple pathways to use resources to manufacture green materials. So, you look at something like green steel as an industry, of course, we have already shown that commercialization in partnership with Australian industries taking charge means that you've got to not only do, of course, the work in the labs and prove the hypothesis, do all of that, as we've talked about, but what does it take to bring, I guess, all of these technologies into real domain is to show not just the commercial viability of what it takes to bring energy into that context, but equally importantly, what does it take to bring, I guess, the entire bigger picture of production of metals and materials, right? So if we sort of turn around and say, right, we need aluminium, we need metal like steel, and we need nickel, cobalt, and of course, a whole range of other materials, we know that production of these materials requires innovation in the front of how manufacturing is actually going to take advantage of resources, both energy and materials. So we've got to sort of put a bigger context lens around all of this. And when we look at our journey, our partnership with, for example, Molycorp in Newcastle, we've actually shown that not only can we head towards green steel in those incremental fashions. I mean, people talk about incremental changes. What we're really talking about, to be able to commercialize what we know now in terms of scientific endeavors, can be achieved, and we can accelerate that very quickly. So the ability to use, for example, technologies that we've generated and produced and shown that it can actually produce high quality steel and metals is the end game, right? So which means, of course, you need to be able to do those industrial trials and you need to show industrial scale activities. But if I can kind of come right back to those small businesses who are also, doing their fair share in this space. And so example of our industry partner I was referring to earlier, of our industry partner who started our microfactories in Kuramandra. I mean, here's an example of a small business who was actually looking to manufacture the world's first green ceramics. Now, where do you find, I guess, examples of a lot of this innovation that can be translated very quickly is in our SMEs, those small businesses who are agile and who are able to take all of that new science and to translate that very quickly into practice. So I guess part of what we are saying is whether it's large or small businesses, it's that collaboration and partnership in bringing new scientific ideas to life to show commercialization is possible.
Thanks, Veena. And we will come back to that question of collaboration and partnership. But Saul, did you want to add anything to that question?
I think the headline that renewables is cheaper than coal is true only under special circumstances. Renewables are cheaper than coal for electricity. Coal at $50 a tonne is 1 cent a kilowatt hour at the blast furnace, and we're still off by a factor of 3. So we need to do what we know how to do immediately, get those immediate emissions reductions, and we need to be realistic about what we don't know how to do and what the real fight is. The other problem is industrial gas. Industrial gas is about 1 cent a kilowatt hour burned for heat, and we're not there yet with electricity. We are 10 to 20 times short the manufacturing capacity globally of solar, of wind, of batteries, of electric vehicles. We know that they're all on the cost curve, 22% for solar, 21% for EVs, 14% for wind. That means every time we double production, the cost will come down by 22% or so. We know just by getting to the scale required to solve climate change, we more than halve the price of the renewables if we also do the regulatory work to eliminate the regulatory burden and stop subsidizing fossil fuels. That's how we get actual, dollar to dollar at the steel mill competitiveness for renewables, and that's what we're going to need.
Quentin, the next question comes to you, and Veena mentioned about the importance of collaborations and partnership. If I look at your journey, you have done so much work to build the community of researchers, to make sure that almost like no one's operating in a silo, and to share information about amongst researchers. What are some of the challenges that you're trying to address, and how are you going about that to ensure that research progresses as quickly as possible?
Thanks for the question, Johanna. I just also want to say that a carbon price, Caroline did mention it in a presentation, this is critical to take up in transformational change. It can't just be from the actual costs in the marketplace. There has to also be signals provided by governments, they're the only one able to do that in terms of a carbon price, to therefore have the necessary financial incentives. So if you are using a lot of carbon to produce your steel, then you have to pay a lot more money for that because you're losing a lot more carbon. So that's just a follow-up on the previous question. In terms of your question about engaging, connecting, partnering, that's critically important. I think the point was raised by at least a couple of the other speakers, is that we can't do this alone. We can't do it in the private sector alone. We can't do it in civil society alone. We can't do it in government alone, or we can't do it as individuals and households alone. So we have to work in that area, that theory of change, and that sphere of control and influence. And now I'm a researcher. I have worked in government as well, so I have had another career. But the point about it is that you have to connect to others. So if we're working in the context of Australia with First Nations communities, you have to partner with them. And partnering means that you listen to them, and you listen to what their issues and concerns are. And if you have something to provide that they are looking for, then you can start to have an ongoing partnership. I think that's the same approach. It's a different approach, of course, but it's the same approach whatever we do. Partnering means that there is a return, in the sense that we are working in a mutually beneficial way, and I think that is got to be the key. I mean, the issue of what to do and how to do it, there's a large literature and experience on this, and I think others have probably more hands-on experience than me in a number of dimensions. But really, it's about a dialogue, which is what this town hall is about. And a dialogue has multiple meanings, but to me, a dialogue means there is reflection. Reflection is about an understanding of what's going on, what the trends are, what's happening right now, what could happen, what are the opportunities, what are the possibilities. And then the second aspect of a dialogue is action. So after that reflection, you determine the actions. Obviously, when it comes to electrification, Saul has made it very clear what the prioritization should be. We see that in the context of investment. We see it in multiple ways. So that's the process to follow. It sounds simple. It's harder to do. And it's harder to do because there are, and I think no one has mentioned it today, but I'll go ahead and mention it, there are forces, there are interests out there who do not want change. All right, so let me just be clear. There are interests out there who do not want change. Why is that? Because they are benefiting from the current system, the current economic system that provides a range of subsidies, for example, in terms of fossil fuel use and carbon use. So expect that pushback, and that's why we collectively need to work together to be able to push against those interests and work in the collective public interest. And that's the approach I would be recommending and highlighting.
Thanks, Quentin. And we will certainly come back to the forces out there that are trying to maintain the status quo. We've got a question that's lit up in the Q&A, and this is regarding leadership in sustainability and SDGs. Gail Kelly, then CEO of Westpac, got them to #1 in the World Economic Forum in 2014, and then CEO of AGL, Andy Vesey, in 2015, was in Paris at COP21. But where are Australian CEOs leading this now? Who might be the next industry CEOs to inspire us? Are they hiding under a rock? And thank you to Warwick for that question. Caroline, any thoughts on this from you? And then to Fiona, please.
Well, I was actually going to cross-reference Fiona, and that is that this really is a matter of integrating. This is like one of my favorite bugbears with my clients. As I started out my own presentation talking about sustainability and ESG, we see it everywhere. Is it just hype? That is not to say that just because we see the graph of the amount of dollars that are being invested in the United States, for example, that we've cracked the code and it's clearly not just hype. There are players out there as well who either through a lesser understanding or a lesser commitment, they want to be able to look green and sustainable to the market, because that carries obviously some benefits and that smooths the way with all sorts of stakeholders. But they're not really sort of committed at the core. And I think one of the things I took from Fiona's presentation earlier was that it's about integrating ESG. So it's not about having sustainability as like a bolt-on function in a company that is really about communications and PR and marketing statements. And it's about, taking the ESG principles and looking at a business and saying, it's in my risk function, it's in my operations, it's in my finance, it's in my production. And every person in those businesses understands that integrated ESG strategy means that our company is going to be more efficient and more successful as a result. I think there are a lot of people out there with great ideas, and they need to be bold. There is increasing activism. We've seen it in the United States, where Exxon has maybe fallen into a category of not 100% committed. As a result of not being 100% committed, it has had activist investors who have come in and basically, against all the odds, successfully commandeered 3 board seats in the most recent annual meeting. And so pressure is going to come from within. It's going to come from without with customers, and we all need to, exercise our vote with our dollars and our actions. And it's going to come from, the big sources of capital when they're allocating capital.
Fiona, any comments from you on this question of corporate leadership?
I think there's a wealth of opportunity here, not only to contribute to the greater good of, particularly as it relates to the net zero transition for future generations, but also at the core of this is, ESG that is integrated and embedded and foundational to an organization's strategy. Just means, the productivity and efficiency gains that you can win as an organization is exponential. So I think that, when you think about, employee value propositions and, increasingly our research is showing that, employees don't just want to turn up just to kind of do their work. It creates this, what's our bigger purpose? And so, and again, purpose-led is something that's bandied about quite a lot. And so it's about really understanding how does that purpose, that sustainability focus drive decision-making? And, when it's up against other sort of priorities within the organization, how do we work through that to ensure that our ambition within those, across those different pillars of materiality when it comes to sustainability, we're really driving for that and, creating the change and impact that we're wanting to see. So I think, the net zero transition, particularly for general insurers, there's a great opportunity.
Thank you, and great question there from Warwick. The next question is for Saul, and from James Lowe. Thank you for this. Talking about that one of the challenges is that there is no single place or expert to turn to help navigate the numerous solar providers, architects, and green home standards. Is a Bunnings version of Electrify Everything required? And if I can add in one other question from another question, is it more expensive to go down the sustainable route when building a house? Small question, Saul.
Um, we've had 50 years of training. Okay, so everything we know about energy was born in 1973 of the oil crisis, where Nixon didn't have a Department of Energy or an EPA and created those institutions to figure out what was going on. That was a supply side crisis, right? So America was missing 15% of its energy. And because of that, the answer to the 70s energy crisis was efficiency. If you make every car in America 15% more efficient, you make every furnace and gas heater 15% more efficient, you solve the problem. That gave us corporate average fuel economy standards in the US, and it gave us Energy Star appliance standards. These drive the world's vehicle efficiency, etc. But you can't efficiency your way to zero emissions. However, that efficiency drives everything, and we're still trying to solve the problem of emissions in houses by double glazing and insulating and etc. That is not necessarily the lowest cost way to get to zero emissions, especially in a mild climate like Australia. And really the only opportunity to do that is to do it when you're building the house. On the time frame that we have to get the world to zero emissions, only 10 or 20% of the world's housing stock is going to be newly built. So you now need to figure out how to do this in the buildings as they already exist. And then that sort of answers a little bit your question about you can do a lot for sustainability when you first build the house. You can't do that much afterwards, or you do it at great cost. Then you've got to go to electrification instead of efficiency, because it's the only thing powered by renewables or nuclear with a pathway to zero. And then that sort of, I can segue that into your second question. Does this require the bonifications of heat pumps and electric vehicles and rooftop solar? And to be quite clear, it does. The more you make things look like an appliance, the more the regulatory burden is on the certification of the appliance, and less the regulatory burden is on the certification of the house or the builder or the professional services contractor, etc., etc., etc. Here's an easy example. The Ford F-150 truck is coming out as electric. That's the most produced car in human history. It will now come with a box that connects to your house and can power your house for 10 days in the US. The battery in that truck is 100 kilowatt hours. It's about $40,000 US. It comes in with a free truck at 1/4 of the cost of a household battery in Australia, because it doesn't have to pass the building code. You don't have to put the bollard in front of it to protect the battery from the house, etc., etc., etc. So we've made into a car-shaped appliance the battery and eliminated all of those regulatory costs. It would be much better to show up to Bunnings and buy an appliance that looks like the solar that goes on your roof and have it installed without professional labor. Actually, that's more of a solution for America than it is for Australia, because we do pretty good at that. But the more things look like appliances and the more we eliminated those, what they call soft costs, which mean the regulatory and the installation costs, which often can be done through bonifications. Now we've coined the term. That is one of the pathways that we get all of these things to the costs they need to be.
Thanks, Saul. And yeah, big questions, and now a new terminology. I like it. We're going to. We heard from Saul around then about what we can do and the urgency around it. But as Quentin mentioned, there are other forces at play that are benefiting from from the status quo. Any other comments from the panel? And I'll open this up to anyone who has sort of a perspective on this and sort of pinning down the challenge and a potential way to get around it. This came up many times in our interviews with the video contributors as well. But over to the live panel. Saul,
I'll kick it off. I started an organization called Rewiring America in 2019 to do the heavy lifting on moving the regulatory burden and promoting demand-side electrification and renewables in the US, including work closely with the US government, with Schumer's office, with the White House on trying to get regulations through. The first surprise to me was that in order to help write legislation in the US, you have to be a privately funded lobby group. The legislation isn't really written by politicians. This is pretty much true everywhere in the world. So to get to the starting line, to have an influence on policy, you have to raise philanthropic money. And you also then learn that the philanthropic money usually is also tied to a venture fund or private equity capital downstream, and it looks less like philanthropy than an early investment in their next business. Both of these things should make you cynical and question the way this rolls out. I then did bloody hand-to-hand combat with Senator Joe Manchin, etc., in the US for 18 months, where we were outspent as a pretty well-funded nonprofit about $100 to 1 by the natural gas industry, which is one of the big evil, probably much more troublesome than the coal industry, and holding on much tighter in our effort to reform US energy and climate policy. If you'd like to have, apart from the Democrats not having a much larger majority, the next biggest problem is the natural gas industry. This should concern you because you are now seeing all of these influences in Australian politics. You are now seeing it's fabulous that the independents are running, but they had to get funded by private philanthropy, Climate 200, to even get to the starting line. So we are allowing too much money to interfere in too much politics, and the big purses are still coal, gas, and oil.
Quentin, any reflection from yourself, and particularly in less controversial or probably less public areas such as resource economics? You've had a big influence in shaping legislation and the regulatory environment. What's your thought on and reflection on Saul's comments there?
Look, they reflect my observations in Australia. Obviously, every country is different and every point in time is different. And I alluded to that previously. It's not just issue in the context of fossil fuels. It does apply in terms of natural resources. And so you have to ask a series of questions. I'm not here to preach, but you ask a series of questions. Who owns the water in Australia? How do they use that water, and what is that water used for? And so when you start to ask those questions, then you start to engage with what is the reality. And then you start to know, as I pointed out in my presentation, that Indigenous communities, First Nations in Australia, own less than 1% of the water rights. Okay, and most of the water rights are held by irrigators. And a lot of those rights, before they was trading or permitted, was provided to them free of charge, okay, as the nature of the being riparian rights holders. So that's a justice issue, but let's get to the 2022 context. So let's not talk in the past, let's talk in the present. So if you want to bring change in the context of how water planning happens, and water planning is really about who gets the water, don't be surprised that the people who have the current water don't want any changes to the situation without full compensation. And so that's part of the solution forward, is to have least compensation so those detractors, the people who want to get in the way, can be stopped, or at least in some sense don't be so vociferous. But again, that does require a system that is operating and functioning well, because most of the money that was allocated by Prime Minister John Howard, it was announced by John Howard in 2007, which was at the time $10 billion. It's now more than $13 billion. Most of that money has gone to the people who already own water, okay, and it hasn't changed essentially the rates of extraction, at least in the Murray-Darling Basin. So we're in this implementation aspect. There's a Royal Commission from South Australia that investigated all this, had 54 recommendations. Productivity Commission has also investigated and looked at these issues. So these are not just my personal opinions. So we actually have to have front and forward, and I'm not making a political statement, but we need to have methods and approaches that allow truth-telling. Okay, so we know what's going on and people are held accountable for their decisions. That's key to this, whether it's water, whether it's climate change, or whatever it might be. Sustainability does require us to know what's going on and who's making those decisions and why those decisions are being made.
Thanks, Quentin. And we are rapidly reaching the end of time. If we could just have a quick comment from Veena, Fiona and Caroline, the one thing that you would do if we're 10 days out from election, if you were a leader of the incoming government, what one action would you prioritise to advance sustainability? Veena first, please.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. I would probably say that all of those regional small businesses in remote and regional parts of Australia, let's support all of the decentralized solutions, design them, develop them to be fit for purpose, and really start to think about economies of purpose. Thanks.
Great. Fiona?
I think it's around just greater certainty from a policy perspective. So then proper investment can be made in the areas of greatest need. You know, starting with the renewable electrification of Australian lives would be mine.
And Caroline?
3 words for you: price on carbon. That's it. And then the market will have the right signal.
Yeah.
There it is.
Let me just say, I really feel strongly about this. We talk about the price on carbon. The machines that exist in the world today, if they're allowed to live out their natural life, take us to 1.8 degrees. So a price on carbon is a good idea, but you basically need an infinite price of carbon today to level the playing field sufficient 1.8. So yes, it's a good idea, but it's still a nudge, and we need to understand the limits of the free market in hitting that 1.5 target.
Sounds like this conversation and debate could go on and discussion could go on, but we've heard many times today, I think as a summary here, Australia is doing itself a disfavour. We've heard this in various forms by not being ambitious enough, but our speakers have shared many actions to turn this around, from pariah to gold medal winner, as Saul put it, and we'll recap the ideas and the concepts that you and the other video contributors have shared today. The big ask of our audience, we've had a number of polls, but if you can share your feedback, please. You've got a link there in the Q&A that you can go to. The QR code is there on the screen. You can share your feedback on this event, and we've also got a question in there on another content topic that reflecting on today's discussion. Thank you to our live contributors for making this such an important discussion and making it so insightful for us all. Thank you for joining, and you can see more. We will be posting it on advance.org. Thank you all.